Hello, Wake Up New Zealand, Cara Saker speaking. This is my follow-up to Co-Governance UNDRIP number 2. So, RNZ reported on the 19th of May 2023, Maori Development Minister Willie Jackson defends Maori budget package. The total Maori package in 2023 budget was $895 million. So the government is definitely supporting co-governance in various aspects. The 8th of May 2022, New Zealand Centre for Political Research authored an article on UN Declaration for Indigenous Peoples Rights, referring to Willie Jackson, Minister of Maori Development, relating to Maori targeted engagement in April 2022. Jackson implementing of the He Puapua plan for not one government, but for two governments in New Zealand, one for Maori and one for others. So November 1st, 2019, Dr. Claire Charters referred to Willie Jackson and the He Puapua report. Charters was tasked with creating the He Puapua report, namely Vision 2040, which focuses on the UN Declaration. Vision 2040, a roadmap planned to achieve this. The two governments, one for Maori and one for everyone else. This will be subject to Tribal Monitoring Committee, which is subject to the UN. The He Puapua report had been kept secret from Winston Peters before Parliament adjourned for the election. Labour did not mention it during their electioneering campaign in 2020. David Seymour was the one, and Judith Collins, who actually opened it up for the public to be made aware of it. They let the cat out the bag. Willie Jackson's report recommends separate administration for Maori land and resources, education, justice and housing, and health, of course, which directly reflect the proposals in He Puapua plan. A glossary of Maori words were provided in the plan and was reported as, for example, Tino Rangatiratanga, meaning exercising of mana, absolute authority, tanga whenua, identifying Maori people, the Indigenous people of Aotearoa, and mana, ultimate and paramount power, authority, where 370 participants in 69 workshops over 6 months were discussing 12 themes relating to this. 1. The exercise of power, the right to give orders, make decisions, enforce obedience. Tina Rangatiratanga, the exercise of mana, absolute authority, participation in government of kawatanga, land, resources and environment, the education system, the provision of information about Maori rights and Maori rights, Indigenous rights, the focus on health, justice, cultural expression and identity, housing, equity and fairness, economic development and business. So 30 years ago, this was namely the devolution of social services to Maori entities. 12 years ago, it was consultation of whānau ora, a parallel welfare system for Maori. The silence is deafening, as I say, around He Puapua, but it's still there and the radical plan is progressing. 26 names were included in the He Puapua report, including 2 branches of Maori Women's Welfare League, Land Care Research, the Wahiki Local Board, Willie Jackson's Te Mātawai Program, Mental Health and Wellbeing Commission, BDO, Gisborne Accountants, University of Otago Academic Staff Collective, whānau ora Interface Group, Matatua Alliance for Indigenous Analytics. Well, New Zealand Centre for Political Research didn't know what that was at that time. They couldn't find it, but I have found it. So Matatua Matatua Alliance for Indigenous Analytics is the Indigenous Peoples Rights in Data, a contribution towards Indigenous research sovereignty, Indigenous rights for advocacy, and actions towards Indigenous rights, self-determination and control across a range of domains, including network sovereignty, food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, and data sovereignty. So there's a Matatatua Declaration, and it relates to UNDRIP Article 31, Indigenous cultural intellectual property and Indigenous research ethics operational through principle as First Nations OCAP. This was developed by the First Nations Information Governance Centre in Canada. And it relates to access and control data about people's territories, lifeways, resources. It also refers to CARE, C-A-R-E, principles supporting Indigenous innovations for community data governance, the creation of Indigenous data standards for allied academics and activists, providing a framework to support ethical decision making, informing law, policy making, and infrastructure. So, CARE principles highlight critical considerations for non-tribal data activists. So, non-tribal data actors. So, those people who are not Indigenous. It's just a different way of collecting data. It's a tribal way of collecting data. So, to recognise Indigenous peoples' rights and interests in data, the advancing of Indigenous peoples' innovation and self-determination. So that's what that Indigenous data is about. So those CARE principles in UNESCO, UN recommendation on open science, the Code of Ethics for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research, also the Aotearoa, New Zealand, Antarctic and Southern Ocean research directions and priorities. The UNDRIP, William Jackson, Ngani Mahuta, and the family of Ngani Mahuta who are involved in Hepurpura Plan thickens. The Matatua Declaration that relates to UNDRIP, Article 31, and more recently a draft submitted on digital sequence information on genetic resources as part of COP15 for the Convention of Biological Diversity. It gets much deeper, doesn't it? This relates to Indigenous peoples and local communities as partners in sequencing of global biodiversity, applying the UNDRIP to the Nagoya Protocol. So that's UN genetic digital sequence information that's reported to be somewhat unclear and somewhat doubtful. This refers to traditional knowledge and genetic resources, observing legal protection through the lens of historical, geographical, and human rights. So some of the steps that Willie Jackson's already taken and implemented and have completed over the years the dialing up of Maori cultural propaganda on radio and TV, enabling Maori wards on councils, non-elected bodies, by outlawing petitions and votes, attempting to change electoral law in Rotorua, the Maori roll voters in Rotorua, the setting up of a separate Maori health authority, imposing co-governance on water services through Three Waters reform, and not forgetting the COVID-19 iwi groups with the blessing of the government that set up regional borders, thus mirroring another prescription in a poor plan. So you have to wonder what's next. And I personally question whether the replacement of the Resource Management Act with these 3 new legislations and the regional planning committees are part of this whole ply, because is this all about the ploy of all of this? Because if you think of it, start joining the dots. When you look back to what was being said in 2007, why the government refused to sign the UNDRIP, and it mentioned the resource management of the New Zealand, and here we have the regional planning committees with 2 or more iwi and veto rights around decision making, and it all looks if it's all tied up. So I'm just joining the dots as I see it. So included was ownership of resources and land. As Willie Jackson, the National Iwi Forum, the Human Rights Commission, the government are processing and progressing with Vision 2040, legalizing United Nations Declaration Rights of Indigenous People. So think about it, people. Back in 2007, that was the old Labour government. Now, this is a new Labour government. Leftist, far left, socialist, with communist characteristics. This is a new Labour government, a very authoritarian one. And when you people say, it seems like they're all on the same page, so when you think of soft law and how these international agreements are sitting there cozily that can be enacted on quickly, great advantage without the people of New Zealand knowing about it, and not one of them talking about UNDRIP as they're doing their election campaigning. They're not talking about UN 2030, are they? Because if you're to mention it, they'll probably say you're a conspiracy theorist or you're far right. They don't want you to ask the questions. Remember, there's no dispute, there's no debate when it comes to international agreements and they're entered into policy, or they just sit there in soft law. Every party is agreeable to that. Wake up, New Zealand.